Hello and welcome to this interview of the Lotus Eaters. I'm your host, Stelios, and I'm very pleased to be interviewing today Mr. Rob Hersov.
Hi, Stelios. Happy to be here. I just
Uh,
flew in from South Africa.
it's so nice of you to be here with us, and I'm really interested in interviewing you. And South Africa is a country about which I'm learning new things every day, and I think it's going to be a very educational experience for me.
I
But
hope so.
also, we have some concerning news every now and then. So it seems like some things aren't going well there.
Things are not well,
Yeah,
as Shakespeare would say, in the state of Denmark. Things are not well in South Africa at all. In fact, it's reached a point where things have to crack.
yeah.
Things have to break for us to actually fix the situation.
I suppose my first question is, what was growing up in South Africa like?
Okay, so I was born in 1960 in Johannesburg to a loving mum and dad and a very wealthy family. So I was the lucky sperm club. That's
Yeah,
one way of putting it. Um, I was born into great wealth in Johannesburg, in the most beautiful country in the world. And it really is the most beautiful country in the world. And into a world that was, unusual because we had the national government, a white government, that instituted a policy called apartheid. And everyone's heard the word apartheid, but no one knows what it actually means. Apartheid means separateness. And the concept of apartheid was separate development. That was the basis of it. And if you roll back a couple of hundred years, the Dutch arrived in the Cape in 1650. Okay, remember the Mayflower reached America in 1620. The Dutch established a permanent station in the Cape in 1650. Okay, so if we're settlers, we've been there a very, very long time. And the black tribes had moved south from East Africa hundreds of thousands of years before, and they too arrived in South Africa in their own time. And the two tribes, the white tribes and the black tribes, met more or less at the Fish River, which is about 800 kilometers north up the coast from Cape Town. And you can only imagine that, the colonial powers that arrived in the Cape and then further up country in the Eastern Cape and Natal met people that didn't have the written word, were massacring each other, very savage people, but also some very decent, nice tribes people. And the white and the black tribes worked together, fought each other, and eventually South Africa was created. The Union of South Africa was only formed in 1910. So it's a relatively new country. It was made up of different unions, federations. And where we got to was there were many wars. There were the Anglo-Zulu Wars, where the British fought the Zulus, the main black tribe of South Africa. And there were the Anglo-Boer Wars, where the British fought the Afrikaners, or the people of Dutch, French, Huguenot heritage. So South Africa's been a warlike country with a lot of wars and problems for all of its history, including South Africa fighting in the First and Second World War on the side of the British and the Allies. And in 1948, for the first time ever, the Afrikaners, who were the majority of the white tribe at that point, came into power. And over the next 10, 12 years, they began to institute this policy of apartheid. And you can understand the intellectual side of it if you're prepared to have an open mind, that there were these people, the black tribes, who were, I'm not going to use the word less civilized, but who were not as advanced as the white tribes by any means. When they first met, there was barely had the wheel. They had, pretty basic tribal ways of living. They had no written word. And so there was a huge gap between the two civilizations. And we know one can catch up very quickly with education, with proper opportunity. But I think in the 1930s and 1940s, the white rulers still felt that, the black tribes hadn't reached a point where they were equal. And so this policy of apartheid was instituted, and it began in a very intellectual way, but then, as with many ideologies, ended up being way more money spent on black kids and way less money spent on, way more money spent on white kids, way less money spent on black kids for education. And it didn't work out. And in 1985, the Afrikaner government decided, independently of what was going on, but pressure did come from international sanctions, that this was unsustainable. And by 1994, first democratic elections, Nelson Mandela's African National Congress, ANC, was elected. But growing up in Johannesburg in the 60s and 70s, and then being at school in South Africa and university was spectacular. Fantastic weather, huge opportunities, a great country. I was very privileged, and I'm very fortunate to have such an extraordinary childhood and upbringing. I'm very grateful for it, and I don't take it for granted.
So you're raising all sorts of issues, and it seems to me that we can start drawing a picture of the Dutch Republic in the 1650s, having won the Habsburg Spain during the 80 Years' War, and then expanding and going to South Africa. And from my understanding, they didn't meet the tribes that now claim to be the indigenous tribes at the point. Who
Correct.
did they meet? And they met the tribes, he said,
much
700-800 kilometers to the north.
Yeah.
Who lived there?
There were strandlopers, which is a direct translation is beach walkers, so nomadic individual people. There were the Khoisan, the original, very, I won't say primitive, it's probably the word will trigger people and upset people, but people from a very ancient civilization that were really not even hunter-gatherers. They were just nomadic people that lived off the land. And the Portuguese, who had, Vasco da Gama, and had traveled south around the African continent, but hadn't stopped. There were these beautiful old crosses that they'd put where they actually moored to pick up vegetables and food. They had faced up to the Khoisan in a few battles, but hadn't stayed in Africa. So the original people that the Dutch colonists discovered were the Khoisan.
Right. So you mentioned apartheid standing for separateness. And could you give us some examples of how was it to live under apartheid? How did this separateness manifest institutionally speaking, and also on a daily human level?
So I suppose the most egregious element of it was that all black citizens of South Africa had to carry a pass, a document, to say where they were from in South Africa, and that they were in white areas to work. Yeah. So at any time, a policeman could say, "Show me your pass," where it wasn't required of a white person. There were black schools, white schools. There were black hospitals, white hospitals. Transport was separate. Everything became separate. And, there were those infamous signs that you can still see the photographs of from the old days of Slech Blankes, whites only, or blacks only. Beaches were separate, Black people couldn't go to beaches that were reserved for whites only. It was a country of separateness, of separate development. And in the 1970s, 25% of the population of South Africa was white.
Yeah.
Today, it's 7%. So the population growth of the black people in South Africa has been exponential, whereas of the white people has been, not nearly as fast. And also a lot of I think 1 million of the 5 million white people that were around in the 1970s and 80s have left the country, have emigrated. It's been a terrible brain drain since the 1970s, because there was this issue of swart gevaar, which if you translate directly means black fear of the blacks, swart gevaar. Yeah. There was the fear of the communists moving south through Africa in the 1970s and 80s. Then there was the fear of revolution, and there was the fear of international sanctions. And all of a sudden, 1994, we had a democratic election, and Nelson Mandela and his ANC swept to power. And there was the Rainbow Nation, the great hope for South Africa.
Right. So I want to ask you a bit about Nelson Mandela, but before I ask you this, I have another question. To what extent did this happen to countries near South Africa, which raises fear exponentially? that the same thing can happen to South Africans, to white South Africans.
Yeah, so if you look at the colonies in Africa,
Yeah.
there were the British colonies, East Africa, Kenya, there was Zambia, which was northern Rhodesia, there was Rhodesia itself, and then there were the Portuguese colonies of Angola and Mozambique. And in 1975, there was a revolution in Portugal, and they pulled out almost overnight. They had a big military presence there, and overnight they pulled out. And those countries collapsed into communism, terrorism, and really horrific situations on our borders. So the South African military was in Southwest Africa, which is now called Namibia. And on that border, the Angolan border, the MPLA, which was the Russian-backed and Cuban-backed Marxist organization, fought against, within Angola, UNITA, which was South African and American-backed. And all of us, my age, went to the military. I spent 2 years as an infantry officer, 1983 and 1984, as did all my colleagues. You were called up for national service. And we fought on the border of Namibia, or Southwest Africa, and Angola. Mozambique also had a similar collapse overnight, people streaming across the border to escape. And that country melted down into a sort of Marxist-inspired morass. And Rhodesia stood firm. Rhodesia announced UDI, Unilateral Declaration of Independence. And there was the most extraordinary resistance against the oncoming onslaught of communism and all those things that we feared in the 70s and 80s. And they held out for a very long time. And eventually, Rhodesia went over to democratic and black rule. Mugabe came in, and we all know the story there, destroyed their economy. So South Africa was sitting there with a very large white population and large colored and Indian population. And I think it's important just to differentiate that there are 26 black tribes in South Africa, the biggest being Zulu and Xhosa. There are 24 other languages and black tribes, Sotho, Tswana, Ndebele.
It's difficult to communicate.
It's complex. And in the white tribes, everyone thinks they're the Afrikaners and the English, the Anglos. But within the Afrikaners, there were obviously descendants of the Dutch, the French, and the German, the French Huguenots who were expelled from France.
Yeah, after the Edict of Nantes was
right.
revoked. Yeah.
And a lot of the names in South Africa, Duplessis, De Klerk, are obviously of French origin. That's where they come from. But on the Anglo-English-speaking side of the white tribes, there are all the other agglomerations, the Jews that escaped Eastern Europe and Russia, people from England, the 1820 settlers, the Portuguese who'd come south from Angola and Mozambique. So South Africa is a very large country. It's half the size of Western Europe. It's twice the size of France. And it's a very complex country. So the sort of northeast of South Africa has really nothing to do with the Cape. They're very different. And there are many languages, nice and complicated.
Nice. So you mentioned Nelson Mandela, but also communist infiltration in South Africa. Wasn't Nelson Mandela involved in communist activity and communist subversion before he was elected president after his
he was
27 years in prison?
27 years. He went to prison 27 years as a terrorist.
Yeah.
Because he formed the military armed wing of the ANC, which is called Umkhonto weSizwe, initials are MK. Now they reappear, okay? So we'll just keep that in mind. He founded that. He went to jail. He was convicted, and he was given a fair trial.
Yeah.
And even though every organization that defends against, these sort of situations decided not to pursue the South African courts because he was given a fair trial, he was jailed for being a terrorist, and that's what he was, a terrorist. But he was released prior to 1994, and having spent so much time in jail, he came out realizing the only way for this country to survive, to be fixed, to mend the wounds, was to be a conciliatory, spiritual, visionary leader of South Africa. And that he was. But in the basic mandate of the ANC was communism, elitism, and actually anti-white racism, which is now coming to the fore, which we'll talk about just now.
Of course. Right. So do you think that he was also sabotaged in that effort by his family environment. I've heard that his wife, during the latter period of his imprisonment, was in favor of some very brutal practices.
Necklacing.
Yes, with black people who were suspected of being informants.
Correct. She was an absolute monster.
Yeah.
She was a Satan, a witch. And, there's one pretty main road in Johannesburg called the Winnie Mandela Drive. And it makes me sick when you think of the things that she promoted. There's a terrible form of killing in South Africa called necklacing, where people had tires thrown around them and it was set alight. They'd burned to death.
Yeah.
This is Winnie Mandela, Nelson Mandela's wife. Yeah. She was an absolute monster.
And you claim that he was a pillar of stability throughout his rule.
Yes, because I think having spent 27 years in jail, he realized the only way to make this country work was to let bygones be bygones, focus on forward thinking. And even though the ANC had all the evil within it that is manifesting itself now, he held that back while he was in power. And he was followed by Thabo Mbeki, who, even though he had major faults, like saying that HIV and AIDS had, you couldn't cure them and they were meant to happen, and he was quite extraordinarily stupid when it came to things like that. The economy grew at 3 to 5% a year. We added 500,000 jobs a year, and there was still meritocracy in the country. Businesses and state-owned enterprises were run by competent people who got the job done. And the country was trending in the right direction. But within the mandate of the ANC, all the evil was there, was being implemented, and has come to bear today.
So I think that in the Western mind, in the collective consciousness, that isn't particularly political and doesn't follow the politics of South Africa, there has been a sort of myth or story, let's say.
The Mandela legend.
Yeah, the Mandela legend, according to which Nelson Mandela was a sort of saint-like figure, and ever since, everything has been great in South Africa. And if we fast forward to today, we've started listening about some really disconcerting stuff, like farm murders. Some people are talking about white genocide, and also complete and total infrastructural collapse.
All correct, all in place.
All in place. So could we fast forward to today and could you please describe, let's start with infrastructure and then progress to the
South Africa is falling apart. Yes. It's falling apart at the seams. All of the state-owned enterprises, Eskom, Electricity Supply Commission, we have up to 6 hours a day of blackouts across the country. Okay, Transnet, the rail network, is barely functional. Denel, we had one of the great arms exporters in the world, bankrupt. South African Airways was the best airline in Africa by far, as good as gone, as good as bankrupt. And these have been systematically destroyed by the ANC for two reasons. One, they break so they can steal. It's all about kleptocracy. And two, they've had this policy called cadre or cadre deployment, which Cyril Ramaphosa has been a fundamental proponent of cadre deployment. I think in 2005 was the first main committee meeting, although they were deploying loyalists well in advance of that, but it was accelerated from 2005 onwards into positions of power, not just in state-owned enterprises, but on our institutions of democracy and judiciary.
Yeah.
So what happened was there's this concept called state capture, and it began in full force when this gangster called Jacob Zuma became president. And Jacob Zuma was in power until 2017. And from 2008 to 2017, saw the collapse of all of our state-owned enterprises, stolen to death, broken to death by incompetent people who were ANC loyalists. Secondly, laws have been implemented, not just under Jacob Zuma, but increasingly under our spineless current president, Cyril Ramaphosa, called Black economic empowerment. And even though that began in the 1990s and South Africa accepted it as empowering previously disadvantaged, what it's really turned into is theft. So 100 families have stolen over R1 trillion from the economy. So black economic empowerment hasn't empowered the broad-based black or previously disadvantaged population of South Africa. It's empowered 100 families. And the families are Cyril Ramaphosa, Patrice Motsepe, Marcin Goshang. I can keep naming them. It's pretty obvious who they are. And then there's a law which was signed into law by Cyril Ramaphosa in the last 12 months called expropriation without compensation. And if you want to think of a more stupid name for a law, something that'll chase away all foreign direct investment, you'd call it expropriation without compensation. Everywhere in the world you have expropriation with compensation. You know, if you want to build a railway or an airport, you've got to expropriate land from people, but it's with compensation. We have the morons of the ANC introducing EWC, and it's scared away all foreign direct investment. So these people have destroyed our economy because they are kleptocrats. But they've done it through cadre deployment and putting incompetent or ineptocratic people in positions of power. We have no idea what they're doing. Break so they can steal. And there's deindustrialization. So fixed investment in South Africa is at about 15% of GNP. It should be at 25% for an emerging market. We are deindustrializing. And the final stat, if I can give you one more.
No, of course.
We are growing at 0.5% GDP and have been around there for the last 10 years. And our population growth is 2%. Every year we get poorer.
So GDP may be increasing, but GDP per capita is decreasing rapidly.
Correct, rapidly. But yeah. if you're growing at less than 1%, you're not growing. You're actually going backwards.
Yeah.
If you would like to see the full version of this premium video, please head over to lotuseaters.com and subscribe to gain full access to all of our premium content.